So, you're attending this session, the 2 most common homeschool pitfalls. Well, what are the 2 most common homeschooling pitfalls that we need to be aware of not falling into? Well, they are unschooling or non-schooling and academic idolatry. Both don't end up in good places. Now, let's examine why. The homeschool movement is now several decades old. Children of this successful renaissance of homeschooling, the method in which our country's first forefathers were educated, have now grown up and are schooling children of their own. The movement is established enough and old enough now for us to see the results of various educational methods within this movement. Most homeschoolers are doing an excellent job. The overall report is good. We're winning national academic contests in spelling and geography and speech and debate, as well as others. But within this movement, we've seen 2 educational extremes develop. Because children of these methods have grown up, we now know the outcomes of both. We don't have to guess. And the outcomes are far less than optimal. So I'm here today to share the cautions of these doubtful routes, exposing the reasons you don't want to academically fall into them. Imagine biblical truth about education as a narrow path. We're traversing on the top of the Himalayan mountains, for example, with a steep precipice on one side, a cliff, and a drop-off on the other. One can fall off one side into unschooling or the other side into academic idolatry. If we aren't careful to look for the biblical path in education, we can find ourselves in some very deep ravines, one way or the other. We can wake up sadly to wasted years in dark canyons and pits we hadn't counted on. Now, you in this that are viewing this conference have had the wisdom to successfully escape the public schools' current darkness, and you're not in either homeschooling pit. But you may be in the grip of several of these methods' tentacles. You might be ensnared at the presupposition level of these other routes and not even know it. Or, having escaped them now, you may find yourself in the yet future periodically tempted by them. It is my hope that from this workshop, you will be forewarned and forearmed for those tempting moments. Now, let's tackle the dangers and deficiencies of each extreme. Unschooling, or for many in this camp, it has slipped into the concept of non-schooling, and my husband calls it cop-out schooling. I have personally witnessed this cognitive blindness, bewilderment, academic lostness, both up close and at a distance. I've been called in to pick up the pieces of academic disasters to try to patch them up fast in several families where they did not do schooling. They had 6 children. And I've seen others from a distance grow up who opted for this route, and I've seen what happened to them. So why is this approach off or not good? Even though it sounds good, just follow along after the child and do whatever he wants to do. Why is it off? Well, because God mandated education. God is interested in you educating your child some way, but he wants education to happen. In the garden, he said, take dominion. He might as well have said in the garden, take your children and educate them. We began in a garden, and we're going to end up in a city. And something, the New Jerusalem, something has to happen between those 2 extremes. There's a middle ground where we grow and develop. So to not do it, to leave our children in cognitive blindness, is actually against the will of God. Something needs to be rearranged in the thinking of such a parent who wants to do nothing. Just let their children grow up like savages, flop all over. Examples of educated men in Scripture also show us that God is interested in education. Daniel knew all the knowledge of Babylon, and of course in that day and age it could have been contained in 3 volumes. All the geometry and all the history and whatever could have been a fairly short encyclopedia. But the fact is that he knew it all. He had studied it. Okay, the Apostle Paul was extremely well educated, as was Luke the physician. Moses was schooled in all of the knowledge of Egypt, so he had a big understanding of history and science and math, etc. So these examples show that God is interested in education. So who are these people who believe that life skills are enough and they don't think academics are necessary? Well, we knew a mother of 8 who didn't seem bothered. Like the Tennessee hillbillies you hear about on the news who've locked their children in closets, they give homeschooling a bad name. Children of unschooling are often good readers, but their thinking muscle is flabby. Progressive academic skill development has fallen through the cracks. The education of these children is like driving a car that has a steering wheel but no brakes or wheels. Yes, many homeschoolers are superb readers. They've been reading since they were little. They read voraciously. But that doesn't help you do math computations. It doesn't help you think about logic. It doesn't help you do scientific experiments, etc. There are whole chasms of vacancies in a person who only reads. They did not learn how to write or what grammar looks like, etc. So it is important to train the mind along with practical life skills for the following 7 reasons. Okay? Now, first of all, why do we educate a child? Well, the same reason we give the child an alphabet. For life, we give them a conceptual alphabet. In other words, here's geography. California is located over here. Here's Oregon. Here's India. Or George Washington was our first president. Ronald Reagan's our president now. I don't know if you've seen that TV show, Water's World, where he goes up and interviews people on the beach. And he asks them basic questions, and they're just clueless. And you think, what have they taught them in these schools these days? So your child must have a conceptual alphabet. In other words, be oriented to the real world. Next, the second reason why it's good to academically train your child is that a disciplined mind is extremely important. Sluggishness and slothfulness in any area of our life is never praised in history or in Scripture. Disciplined behavior brings glory to God. Discipline in body, mind, and spirit all reap advantage for the believer's own life as well. The disciplined body produces more energy and health. That's a no-brainer. The disciplined mind is able to add precise, mature skill to common sense. And the disciplined spirit learns to approach God with frequency and absolute surrender, having worked at subduing himself. The disciplined mind teaches self-denial and subduing of the self, that you're not the last word in history. It occupies the mind. This is our third point. Because education occupies a child's mind with a noble and expanding purpose. It delivers the child from idle thoughts, dawdling, wistful thinking, daydreaming, and unreality. It adds schedule and structure to an otherwise drifting day, so it redeems the time. Another reason why we should train academics is that the Pilgrims, our forefathers, both the Pilgrims and the Puritans, put such a high value on educating their own children for good reason. Having seen the effect of the uneducated mind, which eventually led to self-absorption and tyranny in both England and the Netherlands, they were willing to risk the lives of half their number to live in a place where educating the mind and spirit were of primary importance. It was not uncommon to hear of their 12-year-olds entering Princeton College. They got these kids educated quickly and surely. Okay, another point is that you won't be duped. To be educated means others can't easily dupe you. You can think circles around your enemies. You become the head and not the tail of a culture, the leaders and not the followers. Someone who feels dumb and who hasn't been exposed to a world of general knowledge will always feel socially inferior and will not influence the culture beyond his own life. He'll spin in figure eights, just figuring out how to get meals on the table. And he's not going to have a broad influence if he hasn't learned how to discipline himself. Okay? You are educated because you yourself have been educated far more thoroughly than you realize, even in the public schools. You take much of your own education for granted, and don't realize that your children simply do not have the same storehouse of mental acumen that you do. Is it fair to provide less for your own children than you have? Okay, education civilizes people. That's our last point. It rescues us from narrow perspectives and from the notion that we cannot learn from other slices of history and other people. Many in the Arab and Muslim world are uneducated. They live in a barren, well-swept room of one idea, jihad. 2 billion people who think this way may issue in World War III. Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of England, said once that civilization is a thin veneer. You get people's emotions up high enough or throw a crisis into a situation, and civility just falls off from people. Okay, if you don't educate your citizenry, you'll end up with people living on a level with beasts, living only for what satisfies their immediate, momentary appetites. As adults, they'll live for food, power, and pleasure. Savagery is the end result of several generations of uneducated people. The missionary not only brings the gospel, but the alphabet, literacy, and ultimately a breadth of mind to add to the reborn spirit. Okay, so those are our reasons why we want to educate children. Okay, who else doesn't believe in schooling? Well, parents who are lazy. The real motive behind non-schooling is often the parent's own preoccupation elsewhere, a preference for self-indulgence, a laziness or titillation with passive entertainments, and buying stuff, and lack of personal initiative and discipline. They would rather live for the moment. We know such people, you know such people, who would rather live for the moment. This leaves their children understimulated and underexposed. It is no gift. It is academic malpractice. It leaves their children in the slough of despond, uneducated and an embarrassment to themselves. Undisciplined parents themselves who would rather do something else today, something easier, are people who fall into this trap of non-education, unschooling. And another class of people who believe in non-schooling are people who believe that the child is king in this universe. That anything the child wants to do, they should do. We should follow along behind them. They're the leaders. Well, let the children have their own way. Endless Montessori, only without the manipulatives when they grow older. That there is no absolute body of knowledge to know, so we'll follow the child around. Now that's okay for when they're in preschool and they're just kind of preliminarily exploring the world, but it's disaster for them when they get older. This view believes that the child is God. We watch the child explore, we follow the child. Endless Montessori, we rewrite all origins the way we perceive things to be via our limited human mind. We prefer utopias, which we create. That kind of person falls for unschooling. Now, what are the results of unschooling or non-schooling? When that child gets out in the wide, wide world, the big world, what happens to that child? Well, the child develops bitterness in their spirit against their parents. They realize, hey, I don't know as much as this person or that person. And they begin to really add it up that they have not been trained. It ends in guilt for the parent because they realize, oh dear, 18 years went by a lot faster than I thought it was going to go by. I lost it day by day. A child that's uneducated this way has a low self-identity and low self-respect. They end up hiding and they carry around internal stress constantly. And they're thrown into menial jobs, low-paying jobs, which don't fortify self-esteem as well. So unschooling is good for, as I said, preschoolers. That's what they've already been doing for 5 years. And unschooling might be good for college students who have a foundation and now they need to go out and get mentored or whatever. But not for children in the middle who need to acquire basic skills. Peter Thiel that invented PayPal, he has a fellowship of 20 students under 20 years of age that he gives grants for entrepreneurialism. And that's a good place for unschooling. Let the child explore and let the grown adult, the young adult, explore and find mentors to help them and be inventive. That's a case of where non-super tight structures can be beneficial, but not before they've gained basic skills. Okay? It's like requiring a person to communicate and they don't have a language yet. They don't have any verbal skills with which to do it. Okay, so just as we have not required enough schooling, others err on the other side and the other end of the continuum. Some private schools have demanded too much to the crippling of the whole person. And Time magazine years ago did a feature story, it was on the cover of the magazine, of what's happening to children who have too much homework and who are driven and ridden constantly with no ability to rest. So academic idolatry has its faults too. It's an education without a moral compass. Everyone is someone's child, you know. So knowledge without character can grow a treacherous pride and anarchy in a person, even violence toward others, as we are seeing on the streets today. So schooling your child in academics is not the whole story. They have a character that needs developing as well. Okay, Eve's cardinal sin was lusting for more knowledge. She exchanged trust in God. She wasn't content with his provisions and his wisdom for lust for her own ways. Voila, that was the birth of humanism. So let's look at the specific ways that academic idolatry is devastating. One is lusting for knowledge in the wrong package. Picking the wrong tree in the garden, for example. There were two sources of education in the garden. One was humanism, willful defiance, and the atheist has a continual lust to rewrite all origins. Women aren't women, men aren't men, you don't need to raise your kids, you can abort them, all that. They're rewriting origins, they're rewriting what the whole story is about. But the other tree, so one tree is humanism, the other tree is revelation. That's the belief that there's a body of knowledge already established before you're even born. Some things we can't know outside of revelation. Like, is the week 10 days or is it 7 days? Is sex with everyone okay? Should we only work half day and worship the other half, or set aside a full day every week? Should a grown daughter give ultimate loyalty to her parents because they raised her, they spent all these years on her, or to her new husband? These things we cannot know unless we go to the Bible to receive moral revelation. So life without God as reference point, in pursuit of an alternative reference point, a humanist utopia, preferring one's own limited human rationalism in preference for revelation, is the problem of academic idolatry. This is what Darwin was hell-bent to find, another source of the creative narrative, a source without God. And it is exactly what the elite want for our public schools, another narrative about how life works. This results in rewriting educational materials and textbooks without God. The tree of life, starting from Revelation, humbles the child, that there is already a body of knowledge, and then he will be taught line upon line, precept upon precept, first, and he can explore later, when he has a context for his existence and a context for the universe. So to send a child to school, to public school, for 12 years and never let them mention the word God or have God as a reference point, you're going to produce a secular child. There's just no other way. In fact, about 80% of evangelical Christians send their grown children, their young adults whom they've poured years and years of faith into, to college, and because they can never mention God or reference the life from God's revelation, they end up being atheists after 4 years of that kind of brainwashing. So this is a serious deal. This is a dark ravine if you fall into educational idolatry. Humanism. Okay, now, lusting for a classical education for its supposed prestige is another way we fall into academic idolatry, to keep up with the Joneses, even if the Joneses are anti-God. Choosing classics that are written with no hope of redemption, as in the Scarlet Letter, for example. There's no blood to save you, no way out of her dilemma. Who picked these books that we require every child to read in the public schools? When acquiring knowledge becomes an overreaching albatross, Latin, knowing all Greek mythology thoroughly, and you could name all the Roman gods, which were actually demons. It's okay to know and be exposed to these things, but to go into them in depth and wallow there is not going to produce a life with companionship with God. A cursory knowledge, exposure, is fine for cultural literacy, but to bed down with this stuff is a waste of a Christian life and an affront to God. 4 men who had a classical education with all its prestige and spurned it were, and I'm going to tell you who these 4 men were. Okay? I want to tell you, too, that nursery rhymes, we have to really examine those nursery rhymes. I mean, what good is it to teach a child that his grandmother turned into a wolf and is going to eat the child? Doesn't that create all kinds of fear? What good is that story? It came right out of the pit of hell. And consider some songs, lullaby songs. In the treetop, and when the bough breaks, the baby will fall, and down will come cradle, baby and all. What virtue is there in teaching that song to a child? Okay, so here are the 4 people. The Apostle Paul. Then another one, Augustine. He wrote in his Confessions that he wasted the first 30 years of his life. That was his view of his own former education in the classics. John Wesley found college a corrupting influence. He's written that in his works. And Fenelon, in the year 1717, denounced all the false riches of the mind to be wise spiritually. And you know, the Apostle Paul said it was all rubbish compared to the incomparable value of knowing Christ and Him crucified. Okay? So Fenelon devoted morning time plus a half hour each evening to his Savior. He recalled his mind back to God. He meditated upon the Scripture line by line, imputing it to the recesses of his own heart, and he acquired a quietness and inward rest with his spiritual life. So avoid a too eager and exclusive pursuit of worldly knowledge. Instead, give a thorough and enduring attention to the knowledge of God, which alone renews and purifies the soul, said Fenelon. Those were quotes from him. Okay, now what's another way we fall into academic idolatry? Well, lusting for knowledge at the wrong time. God could have meant for us to understand the tree of the knowledge of good and evil later, when we would need the wisdom of Solomon in order to judge people judiciously. We needed to wait upon God's timing to expose us to this enlarged view of things. And that was Eve's problem, wasn't it? She wanted that knowledge now. She was not content to wait or have patience. Parents pursuing more college courses while they're raising their small children, even in the evenings going to classes in preference for fulfilling their relational duties at home, could be an academic idolatry. When their young children need them at home, preferring their own advancement to their children's stability and security, and their advancement in life, not the parents. So I knew a case of this where the woman went off to study the Vietnamese language and she didn't even need it. She was here in America and had no plans to go, and it was just titillating to her. And I know for a fact that her 2 children cried themselves to sleep every night on their pillows because mommy was gone and didn't tuck them into bed. Abandoning children to raise themselves while you advance your own self we should be asking, what is my duty to these children that I've birthed? And what should I be doing? What would God have me to do right now? Okay, another way we fall into academic idolatry is lusting for knowledge in the wrong location. Prolonged distance education that robs one from one's core family, relationships for years at a time, while pursuing a PhD on another continent Now, the Japanese and the Chinese have had a terrible time with this, leaving their families in Japan or China and coming here and getting PhDs. Now, if it's absolutely have to, that's one thing, but it really took a toll and takes a toll on a person's entire family. There might be another way to do it, online or whatever. Insisting on geographic separation within marriage in order to satisfy the mind's own lusts. I knew of 2 cases of this. One was a cello professor at one college, and his wife was a violin professor at another college, and they saw each other at Thanksgiving and Christmas. In between, who knows what their life was like. They'd call each other on the phone, but who knows. And that's not God's idea of a marriage, where you're mutually there to support and encourage one another every day and give the nurture that you desperately need and that he intended. Imagine putting Adam in the garden and putting Eve over in China. It was not God's intent. And we knew another woman who pursued a career in another city, left her husband in Denver, and they had a child, and they raised the child between both cities. The child was constantly transferring from city to city. They weren't divorced, but the poor child paid the price of the parents' lack of compromise and lack of putting the child and the spouse first. Okay, what's another way we can fall into academic idolatry? Lusting for knowledge in the wrong dosage. And that's where that Time magazine article came in, where we load the child up with excessive homework and quantum academic stress. Private skills have been known for killing the love of learning, creating pride and hatred for learning simultaneously. This morphs eventually into the hatred of one's job and stresses the total family, leading to family breakdowns. I remember one time seeing a homeschool child next to a child that had been trained in a private school and ruthlessly done homework every night. And the child that had ruthlessly been doing homework every night, tears every night, both parents on the child, she was miserable. And I remember seeing the homeschool child was skipping into the kitchen to make 5 blueberry pies and was demanding for the credit card so they could order more French. And the difference in joy in life was incredible, seeing the two next to each other. When the pursuit of knowledge becomes an overreaching albatross, okay? When we're absorbed with little facets of trivia that you could look up anywhere at any age in your adult life. Okay, and an overemphasis only on competitions and scholarships and what they can win for you, rather than having life now as you go or desiring to please other people and bring them your talent and your skill. For example, playing in an old people's home or for the children in a hospital, in a children's hospital, instead of just doggedly wanting the next competition and the next competition. That may be something God calls you to, but it's not for everyone. And we need to examine that. Where are we headed with our talents and our gifts? Are we serving with them or just inflating our own ego? Or another group of people that fall into academic idolatry are people enamored with diversions, excessive experience-based education. Some of the schools that developed for yuppie children gave them classes in African tom-toms and underwater basket weaving in preference for line upon line skill development. Okay? Loving random facts versus moral character training. Not training the character at all, but insisting that the child knows more facts. Okay? Even if he grows up to want a gun and take everybody out. Fantasy. Taking children through far too much fantasy. Twaddle is what Charlotte Mason called that. And these movies we sit them in front of, they're not even real realities, many of them. They're parallel realities. And the Lord said, be careful about that. Divination is a parallel reality. It's a reality he hasn't let us into. And he says, don't go there. You might never be able to come back, is the implication. You might not be able to get back from these alternative worlds that are spawned by the enemy of our soul. So to take children through movies where the creatures aren't even real people and the dilemmas, the evil guy wins, and all these other kinds of realities is doing the child no favor. So altered parallel realities are a real vicious lure in our culture today that we have to be on top of. Guard, be the gate over your child's mind, what you're going to let in. Okay? Susanna Wesley used to teach the Bible instead of Little Red Riding Hood. Okay, let's look at a few other kinds of poor choices for schooling before we look at what sound biblical education looks like. Okay? Now, a poor choice, as we've all discovered in this conference, is the public schools. Mass compulsory forced schooling is the result of a sultan's lazy gaze. Social ideologues have a strong passion to control everyone else's children. They really want to get their hands on your child, on your child's mind. Your children are mine. I'm better at them than you are as their parent. That's the message they sent. Okay, and this began with Unitarians way around the mid-1800s. Horace Mann created the structure for this. He began to relentlessly pound Congress to institute public schools, even though private schools were doing a wonderful job and there was homeschooling going as well. He could have taken the children that he felt were underclass, that was his cover, and gotten grants for them, or schools, or tutors for them, any other way. But to demand that every child must go to public school, that was his vision, and that was his passion. And then John Dewey filled it with his philosophies. So Horace Mann created the political structure for it, got the funding for it, and then John Dewey filled it with his vain humanism thoughts. Social engineering became the goal of school rather than a education of the mind and an obedience to God. Schools became the instruments and the avenues of social engineering. That's why even the topic of history was renamed social studies. They didn't want them to know what real history was like in the birthing of America. So ideologues replaced history with social studies and all kinds of social programming and replaced basic skills with social programming. And you go into the schools today, they're occupied with crises and media issues to up the yin-yang. And the basic skills are being left to flop on the floor. They're just not happening. I talked to a 7th grade English teacher the other day in line at the post office and asked her how she developed theme writing and essay writing. And all she did, she came back again and again to the topic we're studying. In other words, we're exploring all the aspects of this one liberal idea. And I'd say, yeah, but how are they putting it on paper? How are you developing the art of essay writing? And she could not answer that question. So it is everywhere. Even with elementary children, little preschoolers and kindergarten, first and second graders, they will tell them, now what do you think is going to happen in this story? Or what do you think that person is thinking or feeling? And they'll go for those kinds of questions over, can you phonetically decode this word? They just skip over that skill and get right to the issues. And it's a replacement for good, sound, basic skill training, and then do the issues after they have the skills of academics. Okay, so what is normal? Who were the men who told us what normal is? Is public school normal? Were they God-fearing or humanist, immoral pagans? What have been the results of normal? Well, John Gatto says it has been a century and a half of disaster, and he was the one that got the New York Teacher of the Year award at one point. Our national test scores have been a disaster. We are surrounded by failures galore. We're 24th or 25th in the world just in reading. That's countries, we're below countries like Latvia. So socialization, the socialization lie, the mediocre men, everyone should be alike. We should have social clones, and only cheerleaders survive. The rest of you are just losers. Now, let's contrast to what the Bible shows us. John the Baptist emerged out of private homeschooling as a leader of men. Moses came out of the desert. Joash was hidden in the temple until he was 6 years old. Daniel was homeschooled and emerged a leader in a foreign country, not even his own, in Babylon. But what we've produced are children with identical childhoods via TV and media and online and movies. They have identical creatures in their life. We've trained them to be egalitarian rather than creative individuals. So we have in our culture life out of balance. God is nowhere in the story. We're chasing football and baseball. We have expensive uniforms and outlandish travel for our children. We have camping escapades in the public school where you just take the whole class. It's replacing birthday parties and all kinds of social get-togethers that are to replace the family. And as the family is broken apart, the schooling takes up more and more. So it's a vicious circle. Now, we have created a third class of people. Usually we have readers who are literates, and then we have illiterates, but now we have alliterates. Those are children in the middle who can read but choose not to. Especially after high school, they snap that book shut and they never read again. They just watch media, text their friends, and they're just not interested in following a concept through in all of its complexity. These children raised in public school are then bent on passive entertainment and acquiring more things. That funny phrase, sort of funny, that we heard years ago, he who dies with the most toys wins, has literally become our culture's value. So we have taught the what, but the why is missing out of public school. So now let's move out of the K-12 area into unexamined college idolatry. Now my daughter is doing a session on this called Chucking College, or it's something about college. And so you can get a real lowdown from her, but I'm going to give just a short synopsis here of some of the problems of the idolatry there. We have a knee-jerk, unexamined relationship to college, to the college decision. It's an assumed future course for everyone because our culture has made it that way. It's a very big moneymaker. And so they want to make sure that parents are anxious about this clear back in kindergarten. Because everyone is doing it, it's just what you do. And there is nothing in the Bible that says you have to do college the way our culture has said you have to do college. There's nothing in the Ten Commandments that say you have to do this. And so we need to examine this better. College can be a trip into Babylon. If academics don't get you, the dorms will. Why, if these are institutions for the mind, why must you bed down in the dorm beds? And they require it in so many colleges. Why? Why can't you stay with your aunt and uncle or friends that live off campus when you're a freshman? Why do they require this? Because they want to get rid of these helicopter parents. They want to get rid of all the Christian faith that was poured into you and redo you. So why must you be in their grip 24/7? Why do they insist on it? It should make us suspicious. When you can't concentrate in the dorms with rock music and you're in fear of grown men traveling from one co-ed dorm hallway to another at midnight, because these institutions aren't just about the mind's indoctrination. They want access to the moral life as well. These are agencies of social engineering, and they want none in our culture to escape their propaganda and its godless lifestyle of no moral absolutes. Western civ curriculums are gone. They've been replaced with multiculturalism and social reengineering. You think, well, I want to get my child into a college because I want to give them a broad Western civilization, a breadth of knowledge. Well, if you go look at the catalogs, that's gone. It's not there anymore. It's been replaced with issues and crisis and media absorptions, with the Green Deal and all kinds of things that you wouldn't have even recognized several decades ago. Now, there are people within those institutions themselves who have come out with stunning remarks. staggering remarks. One, this was from Christianity Today way back in 2005 in their February issue. One president of the college said, "This is the grisly underbelly of the modern American college, the deep, dark, hidden secret that many parents suspect is there but would rather not face. Just ignore it. The long damage to our children is difficult to measure, but it is too obvious to deny." And he was talking there about drinking and sex that are going on in the dorms. I remember once hearing that the British lost the empire when they started sending their children away to boarding schools. In 1957, way back there in Berkeley, Clark Kerr is quoted as saying that his job, he was the chancellor of the University of California, Berkeley, his job responsibilities were providing parking for the faculty, sex for the students, and athletics for the alumni. And that was his blatant analysis of the whole situation back there. And when you're in college, you go together, you get your first divorce effectively under your belt. No obligations, no responsibilities, and no rules for those social engagements. The campaign against alcohol and drugs, which it seems every American college has proudly announced it is waging, is a smokescreen that covers the college's greater sin of a sexual freefall. That's another statement from from an administrator inside the colleges. Drinking serves as the lubricant for casual sex that co-ed living arrangements at colleges invite and permit. Immorality leads to misery. God hates sin just like a parent hates leukemia. And yet in the colleges we just wallow in it. The 3 F's are what are required in college. In college, students lose the 3 F's. They lose their faith, they lose their finances. So many are graduating with debt that they're going to have around their necks till the time they put one foot in the grave. And their fidelity. The 3 F's, their faith, their finances, and their fidelity. Debt is unrecoverable. We exchange it for a house, and they'll never get free of it. We have a huge debt from our college loans, and then we get another debt for our housing, and we can't crawl out ever. We know of 2 professionals in our city. One is a dentist, and the other is an eye doctor. Both of them in their 60s, and they are still paying off student debt, and equipment debt, and building debt, and house debt, and car debt. So it's a life. It may look glamorous, but there's some serious undertow that we need to examine before we take the leap and see, are there some maybe alternative routes we can go, or some composite packages that we could put together to go on with schooling. So, chasing academics for the mind outside the parameters of Psalm 1 has led their bodies into brothels. Go back and read Psalm 1, and it talks about, blessed is the man who does this, who does not sit in the seat of scoffers. Well, most of our professors, our liberal professors in the colleges, are scoffers, and who does not walk with scoffers. So go back and read Psalm 1 and plug the college scene into there and see what conclusion you come up with. Okay? Now, let's talk about what school doesn't do, even fairly good academic schooling. Public school architects. They're humanist carvers of utopias via forced mass compulsory public schooling. They have believed that schooling will solve all the world's problems. This misplaced hope is idolatry. Now let's look at what that schooling does not give us. Schooling, no matter how brilliant you become, doesn't redeem us. Schooling is not an assurance of being hired. Schooling is not a ticket to civility. You can have PhDs who are rude and divorce and are all self-absorbed. There's no teaching on financial solvency in most academics. It's no guarantee of good decision making. PhDs can get into debt or not marry well. There's no encouragement to think outside the box. And music, art, and athletics are a lifetime exercise program, instead of team sports, are virtually not there. And good, healthy eating habits are not there. Okay, so that's what school doesn't do, even though it pretends to educate the mind. Okay, so what does a biblically sound education look like? Okay, we're not just talking about an education that uses the Bible as their English book. We're talking about the whole worldview of a biblically sound education. Well, the goal is to raise a holy child. Now, that's a very different goal from the public sector's goal. Deuteronomy 4 through 6, those chapters say, you teach. We were never meant to surrender our children to people whom we don't know, teachers who drink and gamble on the weekend, teachers who come from all manner of religions, Eastern religions, paganism, and are involved in all manner of things. We didn't vote for them, we didn't decide on them, and we didn't put them there. And many of them we don't know. A biblical education grows in all areas concurrently. They grow a whole man. Yeshua, here's a verse about it. Yeshua grew in stature, in favor with God and man. He grew in stature, in intellectual stature, in spiritual stature, and in favor horizontally and vertically. So we keep inching forward forever. There's indication that we'll do that even during the millennium or even during the next world. In eternity, that will continue to grow. We're to become lifetime lovers of learning. McGuffey said that. He dangled that carrot. He said we should become lifetime lovers of learning. And a big part of that is staying ahead of your children in reading. If you're 25 years ahead of them now, stay 25 years ahead of them all through the course. And they'll see that as a fine example as well. A heavenly education would have no grades. How do you grade a tulip versus an oak tree, for example? What kind of grade would you give a tulip or an oak tree? And a godly education is not boring. Your children should be wringing their hands with too much to do. They just can't fit it all in. Their home-based business, their athletics, their personal exercise where they're exceeding their past scores and they're getting better and better, making meals for the family. They should just be excited about the day and all the stuff they are creating and growing in and expanding in. So it should shape your day, that in the morning you do academics. At noon and in the afternoon you do home-based business, musical instrument practice, domestic skill development, physical exercise. And at night you do serious reading and family bonding and spiritual growth in the Bible, that you read that Bible every night. You teach your children to have their own devotions when they're old enough to do that. And you start with children's versions and get into more and more depth, harder and harder versions as you go. But hang a broad picture in an easy way when they're starting, and get Bibles with excellent artwork, because that's ministering to their right brain while they're hearing the stories of their left brain. This is what bonds a family, is that rallying around, that cuddling, that nearness, that closeness around the Word of God. Okay? Then focus upon real accomplishment. Children have been given toys instead of real accomplishment. Real accomplishments establish a strong identity in a child, and self-respect is built upon real accomplishment. We have children now who are raised and they're told, oh, you're good, you're wonderful, you did great even though you failed, and that it's hot air. But if a child actually masters a scale on an instrument, or actually writes a good essay, or actually exceeds his last running score, or actually makes some money from an odd job he did for the neighbors, those things build real identity. We're not praising good looks. We're praising character traits and real accomplishments. That emanates from a biblically sound education. The children work with and alongside of adults in real life projects. That's the greatest childhood a child could have. They need to work with you. Get up in the morning to a day of work, not a day of entertainment and goofing off and idle time. And then we need to concentrate on content that is true to Scripture and does not disdain God or throw God out of the story. Keep those children on the press, growing in their knowledge, expanding knowledge of what is revealed in science, in history, and in the Bible. Okay? Topping their own best scores in athletics. You know, the Illinois school, I forget which subdivision it was, but they put their whole school, I think it started with an N, I can't remember, it's skipping my mind right now, but they put their whole school district on morning exercise for an hour. They got all this personal equipment, and they put charts up on the walls, and the children all tried to exceed their own best score. And they did that instead of group sports. And those children's scores, their test scores, went through the roof because their minds were vigorous and surging with circulation when they went to their academic classes afterwards. So have that as a goal in your home too, to keep a healthy child, that you're feeding well, feeding good food, and exercising strongly. Okay, in closing, I want to give you a quote from John Gatto, and then also another quote from history. John Gatto said, "Close reading of tough-minded writing is still the best, cheapest, and quickest method known for learning to think for yourself." This invitation extended to commoners for the first century in America, and it was the most revolutionary pedagogy of all. Those early Americans read Thomas Paine's pamphlets and read Ben Franklin and they were exposed to different thinking and thinking in big packages. And so they were able to develop their own mind on issues. If these are our genuine aims for educating our children, then they are not idolatrous, but rather what in fact God intended for education to be. Let us be careful to steward our children's education along these lines and depart far from unschooling or academic idolatry. May the Lord establish the work of your hands over the work of your children and over the development of your children. Now I'm going to close with this final quote. This is from the Pilgrims, about the Pilgrims. In retrospect, a model from our long past heritage. Once upon a time, in a faraway place, a small band of deeply religious idealists set out to reinvent the world. Amazingly, they succeeded. Leaving comfortable cottages and thriving businesses, they sold off their cows and most of their clothes. They cashed in family heirlooms, bartering pewter and silk for passage over a vast and furious ocean. They sacrificed everything, including the lives of half their number, but they carried with them every book they owned. Upon ascending the thicketed coast and carving out a few primitive settlements, they established a college modeled after Cambridge. The body politic they fashioned included the Massachusetts school laws, the first universal literacy legislation in recorded history. Between 1640 and 1700, they maintained a society with literacy rates fixed at about 95%. No precinct in either England or Europe could compare. Samuel Eliot Morison referred to them as a generation wholly committed to the life of the mind and the soul. By the dawn of the 18th century, the success of their venture paved the way for two seismic convulsions, the first moral and spiritual, the second political and economic. The Great Awakening and the American Revolution significantly widened access to learning and heightened the sense of urgency to maintain both a learned ministry and a literate citizenry. That is what we came from, and that is what we need to return to develop spiritual appetites for holy education. We invite you to browse through our website, homeschoolhowtos.com. There's no dashes and no apostrophes, just homeschoolhowtos.com. We have over 100 helps for you there in both curriculum and in ways to approach your very, very demanding job of homeschooling your children. Thanks for attending.